This is a trigger warning. This video is largely concerned with the concept and imagery of trafficking children. Life isn't perfect. We typically take for granted the idea that a child will be raised lovingly by their genetic mother and father, but things don't always work out that way. Parents die, or fall ill, or divorce, and sometimes parents don't want to be parents or are cruel to their children. And this can leave children without that support structure. Historically, the main way to deal with this problem of abandoned children was with orphanages, institutions where they would be housed and fed and perhaps educated. However, such institutions were often rife with abuse, and studies from the second half of the 20th century concluded that children need not just food and shelter, but parental affection in order to develop properly. So orphanages have largely been phased out in favor of either foster care or providing resources to birth parents to encourage them to keep their children. But children can still slip through the cracks, and the foster system can be just as prone to abuse as the old orphanages. Those children without a support system can become prey to bad actors who use them for their own gain. Vulnerable children who are exploited for profit, monetary or otherwise, are considered to be trafficked. While the purpose of trafficking children varies from region to region, the most common reasons for doing so, according to the United Nations, are forced labor, including child soldiery, and sexual exploitation, including child marriage. And yet this concept of child trafficking is a quite modern one. Go back not even 100 years, and the idea of sending children to work, even single-digit age children, was perfectly normal. Go back another 100 years and the idea of marrying or at least betrothing minors was also perfectly normal. Even today, at least in the United States, it's expected for teenagers to have at least a part-time or summer job. And I'm sure there are plenty of businesses in this country that are only able to make a profit because they can get away with paying the minors they've hired less than adults. And there is a sizable contingent of folks today who see no issue with marrying off a minor to an adult as long as parental consent is given, because parents' rights are more important than the child's, right? One of the earliest international legal documents specifically outlining child rights is the Minimum Age Convention of 1973, a treaty whose signatories have made into law that children under the age of either 14, 15, or 16, depending on the country, cannot legally be employed. Almost every country on the planet has signed this treaty, with the notable exceptions being Myanmar, Iran, Somalia, North Korea, and of course, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Come on, guys, even Russia and Saudi Arabia agreed to this one. Though, to the US's credit, they did outlaw child labor in 1916, only for the Supreme Court to strike down that law 2 years later. However, they finally got a lot of stick in 1938, which outlawed all work for children under 14, except if they're actors or work in agriculture, because apparently it doesn't count as child labor if it's on a farm. This will be relevant later. In addition to that treaty that the United States didn't sign, the 1970s also brought the concept of stranger danger, most famously exemplified in this ad.
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
From the late 70s and well into the 80s, news outlets would constantly peddle the idea that evil, nasty criminals were prowling suburban neighborhoods in white vans full of candy, waiting to kidnap your children.
I smell children. Sick 'em.
As TV news is prone to do, a few isolated incidents were blown up into major national news stories and used to fearmonger, like claiming people were putting razor blades into Halloween candy, something which has never happened. This fed very neatly into the war on drugs, where through programs like DARE, children were warned that strangers would try to give them evil drugs and they should never trust strangers. Even growing up in the 90s, I was taught never to talk to strangers, even if they offered offered me candy. Gotta say, at no point wandering around the suburb I grew up in was I ever approached by some guy in a trench coat offering me pills or pot or even a lollipop to try to get me into a white van. I'm honestly almost disappointed. That could have been fun, or at the very least be an entertaining story to regale y'all with now. A book series that concerns itself very heavily with the idea of trafficked children actually predates the idea of stranger danger by a couple decades. The Rescuers books by Marjorie Sharp. She apparently wrote the first book, The Rescuers, for an adult audience, which I have trouble believing given that it is very short and does not use particularly complicated vocabulary. The premise is that mice run a prisoner's aid society, scampering into cells to cheer up prisoners and give them some company, but the current chairwoman of the society has decided that they actually need to bust someone out of prison, which is met with surprise.
It's never been done before.
A convoluted plan is hatched, and Miss Bianca, Bernard, and a Norwegian mouse named Nils, who is obsessed with boots for some reason, gets sent to the Black Castle to rescue an unnamed poet. Now, in this first book, the prisoner is an adult, and it's possible he was inspired by the real-life Norwegian poet Arnulf Øverland, who was imprisoned by the Nazis during World War II. At one point, one of the mice asks, if he's a poet, why is he in jail? The book never fully answers this, but it's implied it's for being a political dissident. In general, the series takes a dim view of imprisonment, regardless of purpose, and the line, "There is no more wonderful moment in life than when a prison door opens," hits pretty damn hard. A bad guy from the second book, a henchman named Mandrake, is imprisoned in the third book, and Miss Bianca still mounts a rescue effort despite his past ill deeds. Here there were no trees at all, nor any sort of vegetation, only rocks and boulders strewing a great flat stony waste. The wagon trail still ran broad and plain, but the horses didn't like it. Every mile or so they stopped and balked at something white under their hoofs, and the wagoners had to jump down and pull them past. "What is it that alarms them so?" asked Miss Bianca curiously. Bernard didn't want to tell her, but she persisted, and he had to. "Bones," said Bernard grimly. "The bones of the prisoners who died on the march to the Black Castle." Miss Bianca shuddered and asked no more. Some of the bones had fetters still upon them, for as a prisoner fell, so he was left to lie. Then the crows came down and picked him clean. Starting with the second book, titled Miss Bianca, the prisoners become children, and the series turns its focus more to child welfare, but still highlighting the idea that imprisonment is a great and moral wrong. "Mr. Mandrake's often told me," said Patience, "how grateful I should be." "For what?" asked Miss Bianca. "Mr. Mandrake says for a roof over my head," explained Patience. "If we none of us ask more than a roof over our heads," said Miss Bianca sharply, "lodgment in any prison at all must obviously be acceptable, even in one so vulgarly diamond-studded as this." Decades before, research into orphanages found them to be institutions of neglect by the simple fact of their structure. Ms. Sharp was arguing for respectful and caring treatment of children. She even gets in a few jabs at the institution of the police. "Why, you make the poor child sound like a criminal," cried Miss Bianca indignantly. "A juvenile delinquent," corrected Tyrant. "Such as is our duty to pursue," put in Torment, "with the full rigor of the law." "But Patience isn't a delinquent," cried Miss Bianca. "She has never done anything wrong in her life." "But she might," pointed out Tyrant. "Such as running away," added Torment. "They do, don't they, Sarge?" Miss Bianca shuddered, but with great effort she managed to conceal her true emotions. "Naturally, it is your function to pursue," she agreed. "And when giving chase to escaping murderers, for instance, your selfless devotion must be the admiration of all. I'm sure I admire the police force quite enormously. But such a mite as Patience, only 60 pounds, remember, is surely beneath your notice. Really, you'd look quite ridiculous, too, such great bloodhounds as you are. If Patience went running through the forest, surely you wouldn't pursue her," pressed Miss Bianca. Sergeant Tyrant and Corporal Torment wrinkled their brows. All bloodhounds' brows are perpetually wrinkled because they are such slow thinkers. They never think a single thought their fathers and grandfathers haven't thought before them, and even so have to remember and ruminate to check up. But when they've done all this, they are as stubborn as only the stupid can be. "If so ordered, we would," said Tyrant. "By her grace," added Torment. "Seeing as it's her Grace's orders we're under," explained Tyrant. Even given Miss Bianca's half-hearted defense of some platonic ideal of the police, this is the closest to the 1960s we're ever going to get to all cops are bastards. However, don't start thinking Ms. Sharp was fully based and woke and unproblematic. She was still an Englishwoman from the middle of the 20th century and was a product of her time. I'll just leave this quote on the screen because I sure as hell ain't reading it aloud. Can someone in the comments please explain to me why the hell Brits hate the Romani so much? I legitimately do not understand. Miss Bianca, the book, was published in 1962, and only a few months later, Walt Disney scooped up the film rights. This would be the final time the Disney studio produced a film based on an acquisition made by Walt himself. While he was still alive, he had concept artists and storyfellas workshopping it, originally cleaving pretty closely to the plot of the first book, with the poet and the castle, but somewhere along the way the setting was changed to Cuba and helping the poet escape to the US. Walt thought that was hitting a little bit too close to home and shelved the project. Eventually in the 70s, Willie Reitherman was rooting around for an idea for a movie, and The Rescuers was revived as a project. They tried adapting several different entries of the by then 9-book series, but finally settled on merging aspects of the first and second novels. The third mouse, Nils, was dropped, focusing on Miss Bianca and Bernard and their burgeoning relationship as co-workers and friends, and possibly more. For a while, Louis Prima was attached to play a singing bear in the zoo, but eventually he also was dropped. The main plot was largely taken from the second book, Miss Bianca, where a little orphan girl has been kidnapped by a mean old rich lady and her nasty manservant. At first, the adaptation was fairly faithful, and Phyllis Diller was in talks to voice the Grand Duchess of the Diamond Palace, which would have been amazing. It is a travesty that Diller never voiced a character for Disney, though at the very least Pixar was able to snag her once.
Now, why didn't I think of that? Oh, because it's suicide.
During development, concept artist Ken Anderson toyed with the idea of bringing back Cruella de Vil as the villain, but Milt Kahl flatly refused to animate Cruella as he didn't want to be treading over the work of Mark Davis. In the end, they settled on a sort of Brand X Cruella in Madame Medusa, whose appearance and animation was heavily based on Kahl's wife at the time. And it should be no surprise the two of them divorced the year after this film released. In the original book, the Duchess simply wants a child servant to dress her and put her wigs on, and so the search for the Devil's Eye diamond is purely a Disney invention, adding more stakes to the climax, as we'll see. A final little tweak was changing the Prisoners Aid Society to the Rescue Aid Society, which does not make either grammatical or logical sense, but I guess Disney didn't want people thinking they were arguing for prison abolition. Through most of production, Don Tatum remained CEO of Disney, but in 1976 he was replaced by Card Walker, who, like his predecessor, mostly focused on the theme parks and left the animation studio to its own devices. And what they produced is very clearly of a different aesthetic era. Starting with 101 Dalmatians, the backgrounds of the Scratchies often had xerographed line work over top of them, helping them mesh with the starker black lines of the characters. But with The Rescuers, that technique was used very sparingly, with most backgrounds being oil paintings, and the opening credits are done gorgeously in what I'm pretty sure are oil pastels. In addition, the xerography machine was now able to be fitted with a lighter gray ink, letting the characters blend in better with the returning oil backgrounds. All of this very clearly visually distinguishes this film from those that came before, marking our transition into the Dark Age. Why is it called the Dark Age? For several reasons. Firstly, the looming specter of Walt's death. The company was now in uncharted territory, and the next decade would see a series of catfights to determine who should be at the helm. Next, visually, these films are darker than prior ones, featuring more somber color palettes and a greater willingness to depict violence, cruelty, and mortality. This is because the subject matter of these films is also tonally darker. There are no princess-centered fairy tales with a bright and shiny, uncomplicated happy ending. These movies have their characters undergo significant trauma, and that trauma is explored and made the focus of the narrative. These are dark movies in every sense of the word, and the Disney studio wasn't alone in this. Most film studios studios during the 80s were making movies with more mature themes, both those intended for children and those intended for adults. This is the decade that saw the creation of the PG-13 rating, and Disney was part of that trend. But this age wasn't completely dark. In fact, it was the beginning of a new generation of animators at the company. Since Snow White, the animation staff at Disney had been dominated by the 9 old men, and now those guys were looking to retire. One of them, Eric Larson, set up a sort of animation academy in 1973 to train new recruits, and boy howdy was it a success. Even just in the credits of this film are Ron Clements and Glenn Keane, who will be very important to the Disney Renaissance, but also Brad Bird, Tim Burton, John Lasseter, and Henry Selick, among many, many others. When we get to The Little Mermaid, we'll be talking a lot about Alan Menken and Howard Ashman, and as we go through the Renaissance, we'll be discussing many figures of this new generation. But Eric Larson really has to be considered the grandfather of the Disney Renaissance. It would not have happened without him. Animation historians and Disney buffs focus very heavily on Milt Kahl and Frank and Ollie, but artistry requires teachers as well, and Eric Larson not only animated some of your favorite sequences and characters from films we already discussed, he ensured that his knowledge of animation techniques was carried on to a new generation. Another member of the 9 Old Men unfortunately never made it to retirement. During production on The Rescuers, John Lounsbury, in his first credit as director of a film, died of a heart attack. To replace him as co-director with Willie Reitherman, Art Stevens stepped up. He had been with the studio since Fantasia, where he worked as an in-betweener. I can only imagine the kind of impact that Lounsbury's death had on the rest of the studio, but I don't think it's coincidence that the rest of the 9 Old Men retired pretty quickly afterwards. As for music, the score was tackled by Artie Butler, whose only other notable screen credit is Sextet, the vanity vehicle for the then 85 years old Mae West, which critics have hailed as embarrassing, vulgar, and mostly unfunny. Apparently, Butler also suggested to Louis Armstrong that he should record What a Wonderful World, and he managed to rack up over 60 gold or platinum albums as a session musician or arranger. But funnily enough, the actual songs of the Rescuers were handled by others. Disney first turned to Sammy Fain, whose only surviving entry is the Rescue Aid Society anthem, R-E-S-C-U-E, Rescue Aid Society, which somehow earned itself a Lorcana card. The other songs were written by Carol Connors and Ann Robbins, marking the first time Disney songs were written solely by women. The songs are fine, I guess. Sorry to spoil this early, but I will not be singing in this one. I don't feel particularly inspired by Shelby Flint softly crooning elevator music.
Will there be sunshine shining? Will we find a silver lining?
This film definitely has its champions, but there is no one belting "Someone's Waiting for You" at karaoke. Now, the music might be mediocre, but the voice casting, as ever, is top-notch. Bob Newhart is perfect as Bernard.
Sorry, sir.
I'll have it out in a jiffy, sir.
Really selling the put-upon ex-janitor who's in over his head but is doing his best to handle it. Opposite him is the returning Ava Gabor, whose buttery Hungarian accent I just adore.
Oh dear, it's all watered out. Hurry! Help! Penny!
The two of them are just an inspired pairing with natural chemistry, and their blossoming affection for each other is arguably the most believable romance in the entire canon.
Just went through a red light.
Oh, I do that all the time, darling.
Gabor is honestly just playing the same character as Duchess from the Aristocats, but somehow it just works better as Miss Bianca, because she's allowed to be frightened of new situations, and her easygoing open-mindedness is much more palatable when it's not stapled to outrageous fortune and privilege. The two mice take turns solving problems in a true partnership, and it's obvious why they were brought back for a sequel. The villainous Madame Medusa is voiced by Geraldine Page, and I realize a lot of people really like her performance, and yeah, Milt Kahl's animation really sells her, but I've honestly never liked this character all that much. For the most part, Medusa's just shouting, and while I'm amused by the way she says "diamond," she just sounds forced. There's no menace to her performance, only yelling and growling. Compared to Cruella, who got to be subtle and deceptive, as well as tyrannical and terrifying, or Maleficent, whose proclamations of doom are delivered with resonance and power. Medusa is simply a Karen, a soon-to-be ex-wife, and might have worked as a more comic figure if Ms. Page had maybe chewed on the scenery a bit more. Instead, we get this weird middle ground of trying too hard, yet also not trying hard enough. It also doesn't help that this film's coloring is very paint by numbers, leaving her aesthetic design very flat. Just a bright red dress and bright red hair sandwiching a bad makeup job in between. If we're ever gonna get the rescuers repped and villainous, I would much rather have Percival C. McLeach, who has a much more memorable performance, which we'll get to in due time.
I didn't make it all the way through 3rd grade for nothing.
Our story begins with the very first cold open in the Disney canon. Every prior film has begun with opening credits, or in the case of Robin Hood, at the very least the traditional storybook opening. Here we're given a view of the orphan Penny tossing her message in a bottle off the oil pastel riverboat, and while this opening slideshow is gorgeous visually despite the elevator music, I cannot believe the utter audacity of "suggested by" in the adaptation credits. Like, I guess Marjorie Sharp sneezed and Wooly Ratherman went, "Aha, yes, the devil's bayou," and that's how this movie was made. After the credits, we get to watch some rotoscoped humans slowly mosey into the United Nations building before we pan down to their luggage and see their mouse doppelgangers scurrying off to a meeting of their own. While the picture of a mouse helping a lion is directly from the books, as are the walnut shell chairs, the Mickey Mouse watch on the wall definitely isn't. Also, I can't see the name Euripides without thinking of the joke, "Euripides pants, I break your face." Also, the further audacity of one mouse representing literally all of Africa. Man, the 70s sure were a decade. Also, they changed the chairwoman mouse from the books into a man. Just like, why?
Janitor, lady. Good heavens. Bless myself. Oh.
Right, there's plot. The mice find the bottle, and Miss Bianca volunteers to rescue Penny and ropes in Bernard as well. "What do we do exactly?" asked Bernard in his painstaking way, "once we're in, to get the prisoner out?" "That I leave to you," said Madam Chairwoman blandly. "I can't be expected to think of everything." The only clue they have is Morningside Orphanage, so off they head into the night. Miss Bianca suggests they take a shortcut through the zoo, but this ends poorly. Now, this might seem like a brief yet pointless plot cul-de-sac, and it is, but it helps establish that our two leads are novices and helps them bond.
Dark? Who's afraid of the dark?
If this movie does anything well, it's the relationship between Bernard and Miss Bianca. Originally, the scene was going to have the two mice run into Louis Prima's sinking bear until the animators realized that would have been too silly and taken up way too much time, and they were right, and let us all be thankful that was cut. Instead, there is Rufus the orphanage cat, who is both animated by and visually based on Ollie Johnston, who had a lot of fun drawing Penny trying to carry him in a flashback. In that flashback, the cat told Penny,
Faith is a bluebird you see from afar.
Whatever, we'll talk about religion with Hunchback. Moving on, our two mice are able to glean from the old cat that Penny might have been nabbed by the lady who runs the pawn shop across the street, so off our heroes go.
Two little mice? What can you do?
Inside of the pawn shop, we first see our villain as a card-carrying NRA member, which makes all the sense. Bernard and Bianca poke around a bit before Medusa stomps in with a piece of animation that often circulates as a showcase of Milt Call's craft.
Madame Medusa's pawn shop boutique.
Now, Call didn't work on the Madame alone. He was assisted by Jane Baer, one of the rare female animators at Disney who often went uncredited. She had been with the studio since Sleeping Beauty, where she assisted Mark Davis with Aurora, and she was good friends with both Call and his wife, Phyllis Bounds, and instantly recognized what he was doing with Medusa. Phyllis was the niece of Walt's wife and worked at the ink and paint department at Disney for a time. Call was actually her fourth husband, and the two of them had very brash and competitive personalities. Judging by how Call animated his wife's film Doppelganger, I think we can safely say their marriage had problems, but it's probably because of this basis in reality that Madame Medusa has such bite and meanness to her. After getting off the phone with her incompetent stooge, Medusa packs to leave for Louisiana. The mice attempt to tag along, but are bounced out of her very familiar-looking car and onto the street along with her luggage, as Medusa, being a bargain shelf Cruella, is also a stereotypical bad woman driver.
Out of my way, you road hog!
This requires them to fly, which for mice doesn't mean a plane, but a bird, a literal bird. Orville the albatross was also animated by Ollie Johnston, who was very amused by footage he had seen of those massive birds trying to take off and land, and Orville sure is a representative specimen. This movie also keeps hammering home that Bernard is superstitious about the number 13.
There's 13 steps on this ladder.
Which has no payoff, it's fully pointless, and thankfully doesn't come up again in the sequel. Also the fact that the only flight scheduled for Albatross Air is the one place the mice are trying to get to is just insane. Imagine you go to LAX and run up to the desk screaming, "Please, I need a one-way ticket to Nome, Alaska!" And the person behind the desk turns to look at the itinerary and there's only one single plane headed for the Iditarod in 10 minutes. There's nothing else on the docket for today. Now here, where they're tumbling off the building waiting for Orville to reach flight speed, is where in the theatrical cut of the film they sped past 3 frames of a window with a topless lady. I'm not even gonna bother blurring her because she's already so blurry you can barely tell what you're looking at. To this day, Disney has not revealed why this was here or who put it there. Presumably some disgruntled animator thought it would be funny. The only people who do know are either dead or otherwise aren't talking. And when you see this film in a theater, you do not notice. Again, it's like 3 frames. But when The Rescuers got released on home video, where people had pause buttons, suddenly concerned parents were calling the Disney company bitching about why their kids' movie had porn in it. So they had to issue a recall, and every subsequent release of the film has had the 3 frames of porn removed, so don't bother looking for it on your Blu-ray. The rest of the flight is accompanied by the most 70s music I have ever heard. And gives our hero and heroine more time to bond and get closer. As they approach Devil's Bayou, Penny tries to escape by herself, giving us our first look at Snoops, the incompetent stooge. Voiced by character actor Joe Flynn, he is visually based on John Culhane, a journalist and animation historian. The animators apparently just thought he looked funny, but Culhane has taken it in stride, and he served as visual inspiration again decades later for a character in Fantasia 2000. Snoops, the character, is a weaselly wet rat of a man.
I wish you wouldn't do that.
And he looses the crocodiles Nero and Brutus to catch the orphan. To help Medusa search the swamp, he sends up fireworks, which of course fly right into Orville's face, who, after a crash landing, gets the hell out of Dodge. Okay, not gonna lie, that's a decent joke. Bernard and Bianca then run into a whole crew of Cajun fauna that has limited screen time and adds nothing to the movie, so I'm not gonna dwell on them. The only important one is Evan Root the dragonfly, who buzzes our heroes in a leaf boat to find Penny. Unfortunately, the Crocs get her first, which Snoops signals to Medusa, though how the hell do you spell something with fireworks? What kind of pyrotechnic genius is this schlub? When she returns to the dilapidated riverboat, Medusa berates her crony for his incompetence and child rearing.
You are too soft.
Thanks, Miltcall. Tell us more about how inadequate your wife found you in the bedroom. But this conversation they have about making Penny drag up gems from a tiny hole is the exact sort of labor children historically were made to do. Small kids were employed in mines to crawl through small crevices adults couldn't fit in. And they worked in factories where they could fit their bodies inside machines and their fingers inside tight gaps.
Their fingers polish the insides of shell metal casings. How else am I to polish the inside of a 45mm shell casing? You tell me.
Where in the book, the Grand Duchess abducts an orphan to do tasks that any adult servant could have performed, in the film it's made very clear that Medusa needed a child specifically to get what she wants.
I've got to have the devil's eye.
And this sort of work was historically very dangerous, which was the main reason why child labor was outlawed in the 20th century. Because arguing that children needed an education or that they should get a childhood of play and freedom wasn't enough. It had to be made clear to lawmakers that children were being grievously harmed in order to get them to do anything about it. Like every other labor law ever enacted, child labor laws were written in blood. As Medusa and Snoops exposit for the audience's benefit, the mice sneak onto the boat where they are quickly found by Nero and Brutus. We get a brief scene where the mice try to hide in an organ, which is fun, if a little silly. This, of course, gets the attention of Medusa, who, like every woman in a movie before the year 2000, is deathly afraid of mice, so she enlists Snoops to kill them. Oof, I really thought we were past this, guys. But at least we get a good line out of Miss Bianca.
Oh, if I was only a 10-foot mouse, I'd show her.
I need this as a Lorcana card. Please give me Giant Bianca. Once things have settled, Medusa calls Penny into her boudoir to have a little chat with her. Again, Call's animation is technically marvelous. Drawing someone taking off their makeup while having a conversation is quite a feat. But for all her screaming and bluster, for me, Medusa's most villainous line is this one.
What makes you think anyone would want a homely little girl like you?
It's just so devastatingly indifferent. Medusa is trying to win the girl over, trying to get her to do as she's told, but she's just so self-centered that she can't help but casually insult the orphan when the topic of discussion is shifted from what she wants. She can't even bring herself to pretend to care the moment they're no longer talking about the big shiny rock she so desperately craves. Medusa has said what she felt she needed to, and Penny leaves, not even dismissed, because this vile woman doesn't even register the girl's existence when she isn't immediately useful. With this utter lack of hope and rising despair, the movie builds up to its big, tear-jerking moment with the song Someone's Waiting for You. Only to just utterly waste it by copy-pasting shots right out of Bambi, like they didn't even try. And when they aren't recycling animation, the movie just pans over still backgrounds as it does rather frequently throughout its runtime. Like, if this film isn't gonna care enough to give me something visually interesting and original to look at, why am I gonna care about the emotions it's trying to sell me on?
Soon there'll be joy and happiness.
Jesus Christ, I am yawning over here. This is some oversaccharin garbage. You know what?
Fuck it!
Not even 10 years later, Don Bluth did his own Mouse movie.
With blackjack and hookers.
With its own climactic, tear-jerking song about dreaming about a family that really loves you, and it fucking slaps. So we're gonna pretend Penny sings this instead. Somewhere out there, beneath the pale moonlight, someone's thinking of me and loving me tonight. Somewhere out there, someone sing a prayer that we'll find one another in that big somewhere out there. And even though I know how very far apart we are, it helps to think we might be wishing on the same bright star. And when the night wind starts to sing a lonesome lullaby, it helps to think we're sleeping underneath the same big sky. Somewhere out there, if love can see us through, then we'll be together somewhere out there, out where dreams come true. Thankfully, our protagonists are now finally able to interact with our victim of child trafficking.
Didn't you bring somebody big with you? Like the police?
Valid point, Penny. However, the girl and the two mice are able to put their heads together and conceive a halfway decent plan to escape. They make it clear that they have to do it tonight. So, of course, we smash cut to the next morning where Penny's being lowered into a tidal blowhole by Snoops. Nice work, guys. A+ for effort there. Sure, the movie implies the mice were waiting for Evinrude to rally the swamp critters, but as we'll see later, they don't really end up being all that necessary anyway. Now, I might be bitching about the narrative logic here.
It didn't
need the logic.
But this is hands down the best scene in this film, and honestly, one of the most tense in the entire canon. Going down into the black hole is probably what people remember most about this movie, and is likely the main reason why anyone remembers this film at all. There is minimal music, relying largely on our characters' echoing voices and the constant sloshing of the water down below. They venture into a dark corner Penny had been too afraid to explore previously, and when she lifts her lantern, the devil's eye blinds them all with its brilliance. Working together to extract the diamond from a human skull, while the tide inexorably comes in, threatening to drown them. This scene is a masterwork of tension, yielding only when Penny is pulled back up out of the hole to hand Madame Medusa her prize. Unfortunately, it's all downhill from here. After all that gloriously nail-biting suspense, the film ends with goofball slapstick as the Coteria swamp critters assaults the boat. Why is one of them a Confederate turtle? Why is there a Confederate turtle? Answer me, movie! At the very least, Medusa surfing on her crocodiles goes so hard, it swings back around to being awesome. The boat explodes, the crocs turn on their mistress, and our heroes escape, and Penny gets adopted. We get confirmation that Penny is the only person who can speak to animals, which is wild, and then the movie ends. This is easily one of the more mediocre entries Disney has ever produced. While it has some great vocal performances, and our two leads have wonderful chemistry together, and there's that viscerally tense climax, it's narratively uneven, visually lazy, with a villain that is a steep downgrade from previous examples. So I am eternally surprised whenever I find some film critic or Disney buff hailing this as some masterpiece of the art of animation, a return to form after 2 decades of garbage. Have we watched the same movies? Are you really gonna watch Robin Hood and The Rescuers back to back and tell me you prefer the one with the Muzak score and a color palette like a clown car dipped in an oil spill? Apart from The Sword and the Stone, each of the Scratchies in turn became the highest grossing film the Disney Animation Studio had produced up to that point. Yeah, there was a lot of time between releases, but the 60s and 70s were not some tar pit of poor quality, and yet The Rescuers also set records for the company, in fact becoming the highest grossing animated film ever at that time, taking in around $50 million worldwide over the course of its original release. It even outgrossed Star Wars in France for some reason. But more important for our discussion today is whether or not this film is an accurate depiction of the reality of child trafficking. How does The Rescuers portray the kidnapping of a child?
Oh, weird lady tried to give Penny a ride.
This is exactly the idea of stranger danger, and I would not be surprised if this movie played even a small part in the propagation of that myth, because the truth is that stranger danger is fully false. The vast majority of child kidnappings are performed by someone the child knows, typically a disgruntled father who failed to win custody in a divorce. At least in North America or Europe, the kinds of kidnappings like those depicted in Taken, where rich white kids are sold into sexual slavery, happen vanishingly rarely, if ever. Even in less stable countries in Africa and Asia, children with 2 living and loving parents are almost never targeted by traffickers. Sweatshop workers and child soldiers are typically orphans or come from broken homes or otherwise are in a vulnerable position. And the reasoning for this becomes obvious if you think about it for more than 5 seconds. Children with parents or guardians who care for them are going to try to find them. This is literally the entire plot of Taken. Most child traffickers don't want to deal with the off chance of Liam Neeson and will instead grab kids that no one cares about. And in that sense, The Rescuers is very accurate. Penny is an unwanted orphan who has failed time and again to get adopted. And when a weird lady gives her a ride, the only ones who care are a couple of mice. If you legitimately care about the plight of trafficked children, paying a cop to prowl around a suburban neighborhood looking for shifty men in trench coats ain't gonna do anything. Having properly supported and vetted foster care and financially assisting struggling families will do a hell of a lot more toward keeping vulnerable children safe. And who are the most vulnerable children? In the United States, it is overwhelmingly ethnic minorities. Non-white children are more likely to grow up in poverty and in broken homes due to centuries of systemically racist policies and a refusal to properly reckon with the consequences of slavery. American Indian children especially have historically been kidnapped by the federal government because their impoverished families, which have been kept poor by that same federal government's own policies, have been deemed unfit to care for them. So those indigenous children are legally stolen to be raised by white families who often end up abusing them. It is this lived reality that drives the entire plot of Lilo and Stitch, and we will discuss that more when we get to it. The adoption of non-white children from Africa and Asia to the United States, as well as the adoption of Native American children by white families, is in fact child trafficking. There is no ethical sourcing of brown babies for rich white people. There is an entire moral panic among modern conservatives about protecting children from so-called groomers and pedophiles, which for them are just dog whistles for queer people. They feign concern for child welfare, all while supporting policies that make children less safe. You know what would keep children safe? Gun control! Mask mandates during pandemics, proper funding of public schools, but no. Instead, they get caught up in conspiracy theories about fantastical child prostitution rings held in the basement of a pizza parlor that doesn't have a fucking basement. And how about raising the minimum age of both employment and marriage to 18? Well, slow down there, partner. We need to protect Roy Moore's right to marry a teenager, just like Jerry Lee Lewis. And remember that pin about working on a farm not having an age minimum? Guess who picks all our crops? It's underage immigrant workers, of course. Almost a quarter of the food crops made in the US are harvested by minors. And I haven't even touched on the fact that ICE continues to kidnap immigrant children and either keep them in cages or deport them to countries they have no memories of. They do this so often and so carelessly. They even deport US citizens. But of course, no. The real problem is letting trans kids participate in sports, or the precious, precious economy built on the backs of brown children. Child trafficking does not happen the way white people picture it to, the way it is so often portrayed in movies and TV shows about cops and lawyers. Your precious Chads and Ashleys are perfectly safe on the swings at your local playground, unless you have a bitter ex-husband. If you really care about all children, then you need to make the world safe for all children. That means outlawing any child labor and every child marriage. It means increasing funding and support for foster care and public education. It means actual gun control laws. It means a functioning federal government that spends its time combating diseases and maintaining public transit and keeping our air and water clean, rather than rounding up brown people with an expired visa or sending drones to bomb foreign brown people. Because every kid of any ethnic background in every country deserves a happy ending like Penny, and they shouldn't need to dig up a diamond in order to get it. On that rather somber note, I am, as ever, indebted to my Patreon patrons, including but not limited to Gurky85, Avery and their ADHDs, Jinx KB, Savannah Mighty Zebra, Tony Houst, Bewilder Eye, Jekko, CBL, Daniel Osbjörnsson, Sugar Cubed Glider, Lord Christine, Andrew T, Agent Shifter, and Husky Trent. This content is sponsored by viewers like you. It's only $5 a month, or 10 if you want me to say your name at the end here. I've also announced some patron stretch goals, at which I will make some fun music videos. Either way, join me next time as we explore the meaning of love with the Fox and the Hound.